Hello everybody and welcome to my digital art piece time-lapse of a Tiefling rogue for D&D. I start out with some very basic line work to help me get the shapes for the body. From there I build it up so that I can use it as a reference later on. I duplicate this layer before filling it with my base skin tone. In the top left corner you can see the colour palette I am using for my shading. Here I am adding a variety of hues to create a sense of depth. This takes quite a bit of time. But I don't go into too much detail at this stage as I know she will be largely covered by clothing. From here I move on to the horns, which are on a separate layer, adding curved lines to indicate grooves and emphasise that they are three-dimensional. I quickly sketch out a rough idea of her face before moving on to blocking out the different items of clothing. These include protective covers for her shins and forearms, as well as a dress, trousers, and a shawl. If you wish to see the shading of these in more detail, click the link that is popping up now to be taken to the Twitch streams, which are a lot slower. Once I am done blocking these out, I move them to separate layers so that I can work on them individually. Starting with the trousers, we work on one leg at a time to allow for easier shading where I can keep to the lines of motion. I make sure that my shading reflects that the light source is in the bottom left hand corner. I begin to harshly block out the lighting for her face using green tones, which will be used as a reference later on in the drawing, as I like the face to be the very last thing I do. I move on to her tunic, which I intend to have a leather-like feel to it. I do the shading on a separate layer in case I dislike it, and then use a clipping mask to tidy it up. I am using a rough smudge tool to blend the strokes together for a smoother and more finished look. This is my first time trying to draw this sort of texture, so it takes a few attempts. But that is okay, art is all about the learning journey. Next, I work on her Vambraces, which I wanted to appear metallic. Once I have completed one, I bring a copy of it over to the left as a reference, because when I work on these, I am incredibly zoomed in, something Procreate does not pick up on its time lapses, unfortunately. Metal really is a very difficult material to draw, so it takes me a moment. It is a little hard to tell, but here I sketch out the hands before shrinking them down. I shade these with the same palette and technique as I did her body at the start. However, I find hands incredibly difficult as I am least experienced in this part of the anatomy, so I take my time and make lots of changes along the way. I then begin on the shawl. I wanted a fluffy fur texture and go through a myriad of variations and techniques before settling on using a small brush like a stamp to avoid distorting the texture. I decided I wanted a brooch in the shape of a dagger to bring some lighter colours into the piece and tie it all in. For the dagger, I start by sketching in all black in order to focus on the shape of each segment. Once this is done, I fill those segments in with different colours so it is easier for me to distinguish between them whilst I'm working. Moving on to the blade itself, I use a rough brush on a separate layer to give the texture of used steel before using my trusty studio pen to draw some meaningless engravings. I wanted the dagger to fit my character's personality, so I decide to make the pommel shaped like a tail. I use a darkened version of our skin palette to shade it, and I make sure to add some very nice highlights. I also struggle to decide what texture to give it, but eventually land on one that will also be added to her actual tail later on. Moving on to the grip, I have already decided I want a blue tone to this piece, so I go about shading it for a 3D effect, once again using a separate layer. I repeat the process of choosing what type of scales to apply for further texture. As you can tell, I am incredibly indecisive, but eventually land on one I like that contrasts nicely with the pommel. I then start shading the metal which is wrapped around the hilt for decoration. I want this to appear highly reflective, so I use bright tones and leave them largely unblended to avoid dulling them, especially as I know this will be rather small on the finished image and barely noticeable. Finally, I move on to the guard. I decide I disliked my old design and want to incorporate flames to reflect my character's abilities. This is entirely impractical, but aesthetically I really enjoyed it. I briefly go back to the metal embellishments, but ultimately I decide I was right to leave them unblended because they look muddy. I could have made this blade far more practical, but as it is just an accessory, I thought to add these little design elements to give it more personality instead. I then realise I have the issue of filling the gap between the blade and the grip, so I decide to draw my character's hands holding the two segments together. I really struggled to choose between two of the designs for the flames that I had made, so I end up shading them both. The entire dagger took nearly 2 hours to create, and it's barely visible in the final piece, but I am a bit of a perfectionist and I like to torture myself by doing more than necessary. The dagger is up on my Instagram as a standalone post, so you can see the finished thing in better definition if you so wish. We are now finishing the rest of her garments, and this time I have learnt from my mistakes on the dress and use a rougher brush with less blending to create the look of worn leather. It's important to add the highlights to make sure our lighting is cohesive throughout the piece. It is then time to add this light source, which is a flame on her tail. I start out by drawing several layers of flames before realising they aren't giving me the brightness I am after, and the red tones blend too much with the rest of the character. I take a break to shade and finish her face. I use the line art we created earlier as a reference. I draw in the finer details such as her eyebrows and her lips, ultimately giving a softness to her face. Whilst I could leave her hair completely black, I decide to add some blue highlights for depth. It's important for me to now do the background as it will help the colours in the piece pop and make it easier to work on the flames. I adjust the flames and add a shadow before doing the final touches, which are ropes around her boots and in the dress. I then do a few minor changes such as tweaking the texture of the rope and adding some deeper shadows and brighter highlights. And then we are finally finished. And here is the final piece. Let me know in the comments what you think of it. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed and subscribe for more content.